If you feel like your garden hose has been working overtime this summer, you're likely fighting against your garden rather than working with it. But what if I told you that the secret to a thriving garden isn't watering more? It's about finding a way to keep the water that you already have from escaping. And today, I am showing you how to turn your garden into a self-sustaining system so you can stop wasting time and resources and start enjoying what you've created. And a little later, I'm going to reveal a counterintuitive idea that probably goes against everything that traditional gardening has told you to do.
Bring me into golden sunlight.
Today, we're breaking down a few easy and effective ways to essentially turn your garden soil into a moisture lock. So one of the first things that I've learned how to do in my garden to help preserve moisture is to think about what I'm planting and how I'm planting it. So one of the first tips I would have is to plant intensively. So essentially what this means is when you're planting your garden and you're placing plants in a garden bed, thinking about planting them and spacing them shoulder to shoulder. When you place and space plants more closely together, is you're providing less opportunity for hot sun and those drying winds to dry out the soil beneath them. The foliage of the plants act as a sort of canopy that helps keep the soil more moist and more cool. One cautionary tale that I have about planting things close together is to not overcrowd them and estimate what the mature size of your plants will be. So I've been notorious about really trying to jam lots of plants into my garden and put lots of things together in one space. But you don't want to do that too much. You want to just estimate what the mature size will be and overlap that just a bit. But I think the lesson in all this is that that's not a permanent problem. If you have overcrowded some of your plants a bit, especially if they're annuals or certain kinds of herbaceous perennials, you can move them and correct the situation. So another idea on this idea of intensive planting is to use ground covers or cover crops. Essentially what this is going to do is also lock in that moisture in your soil and help shade the soil around your other plants. So I would suggest if you're going to use ground covers around perennials, shrubs, or trees, to probably use a perennial ground cover. If it's really sunny or really shady, you have a wide variety of things that you could use. And it also depends on your area and what's going to grow well in your area. My idea for annual cover crops could include things I would use in your vegetable garden, for instance. In my veggie beds this year, I have some tomatoes growing, and beneath that I'm using some basil. Using annual herbs like basil is a great way to cover the soil underneath my tomatoes and help keep the moisture in. And both are kind of like companion plants and they help each other. You could also use things like from the legume family, like peas or beans, or even crimson clover, because you can harvest the crop from these plants, and you can also just work them back into the soil when you're done with them, and they will actually add nutrients back into the soil. You may have heard the term green manure, and these are great for that. Another great idea to help you to retain moisture in your soil for the long term is to think about planting in communities. So putting things together that like the same kind of soil conditions and the same kind of watering requirements. Essentially, you're taking that guessing game out of wondering what kind of water one plant needs and the other one doesn't. So that way you're not overwatering something and underwatering something else that's in the same area. And you may find when you discover plants that like the same soil conditions actually are kind of meant to be together because they've been growing in similar environments anyway. So here's a great example in my garden where I've planted in a community. I've also applied some of those other principles that I talked about earlier in the video. I've planted these plants fairly closely together, so they create the look of a real blended mass of plants. They're shoulder to shoulder without really overcrowding. And in this community that I created, I tried to put plants that were more drought tolerant. So from the beginning, these plants are already going to need less water, and I don't have to worry about maintenance as much with that. The particular plants that I've included in here are baptisia, coneflower, native grasses. I've got some anise hyssop in here that you may not be able to see, but these are all like native prairie plants for me. And they work really well together as a group just because they're kind of from the same region and they work in that way. So I encourage you to do some research and find out which kind of plants are native to your area, because they're already adapted to the conditions that you grow in now. And you've already lowered the barrier in terms of maintenance and having to water your garden a lot, because they already know how to thrive and survive in the soil conditions that you already have. And if you're wondering about some other drought-tolerant options, I did create a video about this, which I will link right here so you can check that out later. Now with my next tip, this can truly make or break that system that you're trying to set up with retaining moisture in your soil. And it all starts at the ground level. So this is all about mulch. And I've been using mulch for years because I discovered that it was one of the best ways to retain moisture in your soil. But there are definitely some really good things about mulching and some bad things, depending on how you do it and what kind of products you use to mulch your soil. The basics of mulch is that it covers the soil and it locks in moisture that exists in the soil already. And as the mulch breaks down, it adds nutrients to your soil. So what kind of mulch you use really does matter. So one of my first go-tos I would suggest is using organic materials. I use mulches a lot when I'm planting new garden beds and my plants are smaller and they aren't touching shoulder to shoulder yet, and I've got a lot of bare ground exposed. So the mulch will cover that bare ground until the plants get larger, and then I don't need as much. So when you add mulch to your soil, it has so many benefits as it breaks down. It helps feed the good bacteria, fungi, and other microbes that help feed your soil and help your plants grow strong. So all the benefits that I described with organic mulches don't exist in these other non-organic mulches that I really don't want you to use in your garden, because they not only don't help your garden, they can cause harm. So some of the bad ones on the list I would suggest are petroleum-based products, plastic sheeting, landscaping fabric, rubber mulch, which is like ground up pieces of rubber. So one of the main goals when you're applying mulch is to keep the soil cool and moist. Adding black plastic around your plants is only going to heat it up. So that doesn't make any sense at all to me. Also, plastic products are going to break down over time, but not in a good way. You may know, like with microplastics, are going to break down into smaller and smaller pieces, and that's going to live forever in your garden soil. So one last side note about using organic mulches in your garden is how you're applying the mulch. So I've seen a lot of people where they take mulch and they keep piling it up year after year, so you end up with this really thick layer of mulch, and that's not necessarily good, because if you just keep applying the mulch, it may be getting moldy underneath and also inhibiting light and moisture from getting down into the soil where you need it. One thing I would do is to break up that mulch every once in a while, spread it around before you add new mulch on top. So that gives the wood or the other cuttings that you put on the soil time to break down and actually incorporate into the soil. Make sure the soil is moist before you put the mulch down, because then you're trapping that moisture in and you're not blocking the moisture from getting down where you need it. So I'm really curious to hear what you think of the suggestions I've had so far in the video, so please leave a comment below. Now, before I get to that counterintuitive idea that I promised at the beginning of this video, I wanted to talk about one more idea that you can apply to your garden that will help keep more moisture in. And that's actually to add some structures to your garden that will add a little bit of shade. So I have a couple of arbors in my garden that we built, and I grow climbing vines on them. They aren't like permanent structures that are going to add a lot of deep shade because they have solid walls and a roof. So as the light moves around during the day, that will create some more areas with a little bit of dappled shade. So if I have some plants that need a little bit of relief from intense afternoon sun, this is a great option for that. And of course, if you have less sun, it's not going to be drying out your soil more quickly. Now, if you think building a structure like an arbor sounds like too much work, my next counterintuitive tip will actually save you work. And it's actually something that a lot of us gardeners are told we should never do, and that's to leave the weeds alone. So by definition, weeds are simply plants that are in the wrong place at the wrong time. And there's probably lots of reasons why you've heard that you should pull the weeds and not leave them in your garden. Some of those reasons might be that the weeds spread. And so once you start leaving weeds in your garden, you're going to lose control and you're never going to be able to get it back to the way it was. Another reason that people say to pull the weeds is that they are going to compete with the plants that you want, and they're going to take away nutrients from those plants. Lastly, another reason that you might worry about leaving the weeds is that somehow they're going to bring in other diseases and pests to your garden. So I think all of these reasons can be true and not true at the same time. I think it really depends on the kind of management system that you're creating in your garden when it comes to weeds. So in this section and some other places in my garden, I actually have a lot of weed seedlings. So some of these may be invasive weeds. Some may be just seedlings from some of my other plants that have self-seeded from last fall. And I just make a judgment about which ones I want to leave that may be actually bad for my garden, like certain kinds of grasses that have spreading rhizomes. But some of those seedlings that I have from some of my perennials, for instance, I will leave those because I could possibly use those in another area of my garden, and they're not doing any harm at this point. Another thing I've discovered too, that if I'm actively mulching in my garden and keeping that soil more moist, I've discovered that pulling weeds is a heck of a lot easier. So in some ways, having lots of plants, including some weeds, help to kind of create a cooling effect in your garden. One comparison that might be helpful to think about is having a forest compared to an asphalt parking lot. Which one do you think is going to be cooler and retain more moisture in your soil? So by having a garden full of plants and a few weeds, you're kind of creating a bit of a heat sink and keeping that moisture in. Weeds can also help provide nutrients in your garden. They don't just take away. So any kind of plant, when it breaks down and decomposes, is going to add nutrients to your soil. What about just cutting them off and letting them rot in your garden? That again is going to add some kind of like a green manure effect in your garden, and it's really beneficial to the plants around them. Some so-called weeds that have deeper taproots that send their roots deep down into the soil, they're actually helping to bring those nutrients back up to the surface of the soil, which in turn helps your garden as well. And lastly, I like to think of some of the weeds, as I mentioned before, as next year's plants. If you leave a few of those seedlings, you may discover that you're glad that you did that, because now you've got some new plants for free. Okay, so here's a tip that might seem really obvious, and it's about watering smart. So I know that a lot of us have heard recommendations for how to water your garden, but honestly, a lot of you are doing it wrong. So watering is one of those things that you want to do less, and you want to do it efficiently. I think if we just use a little bit of common sense here, and we can think about, of course, in hotter weather, water is going to evaporate more quickly, right? So think about watering your garden if you need to add extra water in the early morning or the early evening hours. Alternatively, you can water when it's cooler outside. And so that's going to slow down the evaporation of the water that you're applying to your plants. Next, when you're watering your plants, make sure that you're watering them deeply and at the root level. Please, please, don't take the garden hose or the sprinkler and be watering everything generally overhead and spraying water all over the leaves of your plants. There's a lot of issues with doing this. Number one, it's not very efficient. You're not getting that water down at the base or at the soil level where you need it. You're also causing a lot of that water just to evaporate into the air. So again, you're not getting it, you're not using it effectively. And also, if you're just kind of randomly watering all of the foliage of your plants, a lot of that water may be sitting on the foliage and could cause problems like diseases in your plants. So another thing I'd like you to think about is where you're getting your water from. I try not to use the garden hose or use drip irrigation where I'm getting water from my house. Number one, it's really expensive right now, and I don't want to have to raise my utility bill. And also, some of the city water as well as some well water may have contaminant in it or certain chemicals that I may not want in my garden, especially if I'm growing food crops. I have a rain barrel, so I collect rainwater. I also have a couple small ponds that I built, and I use some of that water too to supplement if it's been really hot and dry in the garden. So by working with nature, by shading the soil in smart ways, planting plants more effectively that are resilient and in communities, as well as using water more effectively, I think we can get more enjoyment out of our gardens and spend less time worrying about maintenance. So let me know which kind of methods you've used in your garden, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.
Never the same.